Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's been a pleasure to be here and to listen to the various presentations of yesterday and this morning. I'm actually taking a slightly broader topic, and I'm looking at sustainable development governance. And what I hope to do with this morning is to give you a sense of where we are on the debate on sustainable development governance, where we're heading, both inside the United Nations system and outside the United Nations system. In some way, if we were really ahead on sustainable development governance, you might see captions like this in Le Monde, where we actually, at a broad global level, start having some real impact about what we are trying to do about sustainable development. We obviously have a long way to go, but I think that this broader context is very important for us to appreciate. Of course, what we mean by sustainable development governance depends on its three separate components. And in that sense, one way of looking at it is to have the environmental governance part, the social governance part, and the economic governance part. There are, of course, others who say, well, it also needs to include climate governance, health governance, trade governance. In fact, you could take all the possible topics that might be in sustainable development goals and say we should look at their governance. But as a matter of reality, in the negotiations by the governments, none of these governance issues are parts of the conversation. Also, where sustainable development goes as a governance matter depends not only on the components of what are being discussed, but how we stitch them together, both inside the UN and how they're being proposed to stitch them together outside the United Nations. Where are we at the moment? On environmental governance, we've made two big improvements in the last, from Rio. One is UNEP is now a universal body. All countries are part of its governance. Civil society organizations have far greater influence in the UNEP Governing Council process. And UNEP's budget has been changed. Another, which probably less recognized, is that the mandate of the Economic and Social Council as a charter body was changed in Rio and by the adoption of the report in the General Assembly. In the charter, the Economic and Social Council deals with economic and social matters. But there's a key paragraph in the text which, by altering the charter by practice, the text says, looking at the charter paragraphs, the Economic and Social Council will deal with economic, social, environmental, and other matters. So now the mandate of ECOSOC has incorporated explicitly environment and potentially other issues of that category. So there have been changes in our system for environmental governance. In the socials field, to my perspective, nothing's happening. We should be aware of that. On economic governance, well, there's still debates about changing a couple of percentage points in the governing structures at the international financial institutions. We do have a change in that the G20 feel that they can give direct instructions to the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO. And the president of the GA, the last president of the GA, had a session on and a report to the Stiglitz Commission on global economic crises. And this may or may not have a life and a change in the conversation about economic governance. On stitching them together, there are two issues now coming through the General Assembly. One is, what do we mean, and this came out of Rio, about this high-level political forum, and what do we mean about mainstreaming sustainable development in the Economic and Social Council? Outside the UN system, Davos in 2009 and 2010 brought together a large number of experts and have proposed in a lengthy report a post-nation-state governance system to move to address the issues that they saw were raised by the start of the financial crisis. I'm always intrigued that they chose the name for their report of Everybody's Business. When I first saw that, I said, I've seen this title before, and I checked back on Google. It had been a title brought out by a critical group who produced a paper about a book on what were multinationals, and they called that title Everybody's Business. But the intellectual property people at Davos apparently missed this overlap. Davos takes seriously sustainable development. Most of the report, 500 pages of the 600 pages, are reports of individual task forces. They had 45 of them. This is a listing of just those under their title of sustainable development. And you can see the breadth which they are attempting to conceptualize a system of sustainable development governance by looking at these components of it through various global agenda councils, which I'll return to a little bit later. As part of this effort, the Center for Governance and Sustainability at the University of Massachusetts in Boston has brought out a reader's guide to the Davos proposals as a way of looking at it and interpreting what they are, both by looking at individual sections of the text and with a series of analytic essays. And that'll form a part of my presentation to you today. So where are we in terms of the actual discussions going on inside the United Nations? And I will return to what's also going on outside the United Nations on sustainable development governance. Where we start from is sort of captured by this series of circles. The General Assembly names the 48 members of the Economic and Social Council. They, in turn, have named the 48 members of the Commission on Sustainable Development. The international financial institutions relate to the Economic and Social Council and to the Commission on Sustainable Development, as do specialized agencies, as does major groups, combinations of civil society and business. This is the structure that existed from following 92, the original conference in 92, and by about 3 or 4 years ago, both governments and civil society became frustrated about whether the Commission on Sustainable Development was delivering and able to be the bridge between economic governance, social governance, and environmental governance. One of the outcomes of the Rio process is that there's a general understanding the Commission on Sustainable Development will disappear. There is also, in the General Assembly, the second committee of the General Assembly, which deals with economic matters, and the third committee, which deals with humanitarian and human rights issues. And there's a division, a bit fuzzy division, between the General Assembly's committee, which involves all countries, and what issues of sustainable development are handled in a more limited membership under the Economic and Social Council. That relevance of that, I hope, will become clearer in a moment. So, how are the negotiations going? On the high-level political forum, the spirit had been going into Rio conference and coming out, is that they would bring together heads of state and leading ministers on an annual basis to give broad political guidance as to where and how sustainable development governance inside the UN should occur. And that the day in and day out management and governance of all these issues would be with the Economic and Social Council. But they really didn't understand, and I think also civil society didn't really understand, what it is that this was going to be. And so all that came out of Rio was, we will agree that we will negotiate a high-level political forum and a role for the Economic and Social Council in sustainable development governance. Well, what they have at the expectation is that they would have completed their work on this piece of it by the end of May, because the first meeting is provisionally scheduled for the middle of September. At the moment, the negotiations are continuing. Give you a sense of what has been in general agreed in the room and what is still dividing countries. And it should be an issue of figuring out where that element of sustainable development governance, various people think ought to be the direction. The two bits which are clear is that it'll be a hybrid body, partly sitting under the General Assembly and partly sitting under the Economic and Social Council in the years in which the General Assembly does not consider it. It will also, in terms of government participation, be universal. So even if it meets under the Economic and Social Council, which has 48 members, all countries can take part in the high-level political forum. That is where there is common agreement. What there isn't common agreement about as of a week ago was whether the high-level political forum will be expected at least every 4 years to be at the heads of state and government level, or just high officials, or just ministers. So that issue remains alive as to what level the high-level political forum will operate at, and whether it, from its capitals, will be the heads of governments and states or just key ministers. Also unclear is how major groups in the private sector will take part in the event. There is a sense that the practices that have been developed under the Commission on Sustainable Development will be moved over to this new body. But as the General Assembly has never had direct access to it by civil society or business, this is raising all sorts of complications. So the actual role that major groups will play in the new arrangement is not yet clear. It's also not clear between the governments what they want this body to do. Do they want it when the heads of state meet for a couple of days, let's say heads of state, are they to just deliver broad policy statements about here's how we want the UN system now to work? Do they actually want to sit and review what has been accomplished since their last meeting on sustainable development? Is this the body that's going to supervise the sustainable development goals? And then, how do we get ready for the high-level political forum? The initial proposal from the facilitators and the Secretariat was there should be a 2-week high-level senior officials meeting. Many delegations say, well, if we have a 2-week senior officials meeting, this is actually just recreating the Commission on Sustainable Development, which met for 2 weeks, which we're trying to get rid of. So how does the process of getting ready for whatever it is that the senior officials at whatever level they decide will be prepared? And also not clear as to what is the expected outcome. Is it a negotiated text to be accomplished by the government officials who come, or just a summary of the views expressed by the President? This, as I say, as of a week ago, this is where the issues outstanding, but negotiations have been continuing this past week. On getting the Economic and Social Council involved, there are at least 3 elements which they have agreed to. The Economic and Social Council historically has met for 1 month a year in July, rotating between New York and Geneva. Now it will probably start meeting in January through July, that is, annualizing its schedule. September to December being set aside for the General Assembly. And this allows much more time for the Economic and Social Council to be engaged on the breadth of the issues which come under sustainable development. It will be the host of the high-level political forum when the General Assembly is not considering it, which could be for 2 or 3 years in between the sessions of the GA. And it will have a key theme each year selected before the start of this annual cycle to try to provide some guidance to all the parts of the UN system as to what focus to give each year's contribution to the ECOSOC discussions. That's agreed. What's still on the table is to take apart the July calendar, add in new features, and to redesign how the Economic and Social Council will now function. And here are some of what were segments of the Economic and Social Council, which were generally 1 to 2 days, which will now be moved in one view into a week-long session. And here are some of the now what's going to be called segments, and these are the range of them that's been proposed by the facilitators. Not yet agreed, but something of this nature to provide the dynamic for the first half of the year. In the proposal is that the migration of the Economic and Social Council back and forth between Geneva and New York will cease, except for the humanitarian segment. A new departure is an explicit invitation to countries to approach the Economic Social Council for additional attention when they're facing humanitarian, environmental, or other crises. In some fashion, making the Economic and Social Council in those areas the way in which countries can approach the Security Council when they are feeling a threat of a military crisis. And so this is a proposal that should be a way in which this ECOSOC might work. They will continue 2 features that are parts of the ECOSOC, but they will revise them. And they too are struggling about how to move major groups into the ECOSOC because they have, as you know, consultative NGOs as a body. And how do we now bring in many, many more organizations as parts of major groups? The third level, and I'll just go over this quickly, is a separate independent resolution on the issue of global governance. And because of its economic aspects, it has a direct bearing on sustainable development governance, in my view. They're trying to determine how the General Assembly will relate to the G20, how they'll divide the responsibilities for economic governance between the Economic and Social Council and the General Assembly, how to allow regional trade, investment, regional integration bodies to deal with the General Assembly. At the moment, these bodies have no international platform to share the views from their regional organizational perspective on the global scene. And how to get if the Financial Stability Board will start engaging with New York. So those are the quick summary of the outstanding issues on 3 sets of negotiations, all of which will lay the basis for where inside the UN, for at least the next 10 years, sustainable development governance and institutional arrangements will function. Outside the UN, as I indicated, the World Economic Forum's work, they want to build a new global governance system with a different set of concepts of what constitutes global governance by putting the multinationals and the globalized economy in the center of the governance story, recognizing that nation states have some role, recognizing civil society groups have some role, but they are reconfiguring in their approach the concepts of global governance. And they're proposing multi-stakeholder governance as a new version of how to handle issues where key companies, key countries, key civil society organizations will grapple with separate issues. And that is what, and the global agenda councils are part of their effort in that regard. But part of the approach that they take is a completely voluntaristic one. You can join if the others want you to be part of that group. You have no legal obligation to follow up with the outcome of that proposal. You have no liabilities. So you can opt in or opt out of the outcome of a multi-stakeholder governance approach, be you a government or a civil society or a firm. They want to stabilize the G20. And in my view, they are arguing for a more public-private United Nations system than we currently have. And I can share more views about that part of the story if you wish. To give you a sense of how they are approaching this, they have a series of bullets and steps and guiding posts in their executive summary. And the first one of which conveys the way in which they are thinking in one key fashion, is to say that the international system has multifaceted elements, part of which is the rule of law. That should be the core, but not the sole, and sometimes not the most crucial component. And those are to be the multi-stakeholder governance arrangements. The Reader's Guide to the Davos proposal, this is the website address, and there's a handout outside, can provide you the link to seeing other of their basic principles for redefining what should be sustainable development governance in a post-nation state arrangement. What is important to recognize about the WEF's proposals is that almost all of them can be put into place without a formal decision of any intergovernmental body. And we will, and we are, hearing elements of their proposals in individual pieces in separate discussions occurring across the UN system. So it is helpful, in my view, to look at a coherent argument about how the individual pieces can tie together. So how do we look at our analyzing and our lobbying? I wasn't just being facetious by putting up this slide for what a newspaper might look like. It is important that we look at how major macroeconomic issues like capital controls and bank transfers and how sustainable development at a macroeconomic level is or isn't occurring. It is also very important that we look at what is happening in terms of individual key sectors and how they are relating to their individual communities, following some of the parts that are related to what we were just hearing. It is important that we look at democracy in a quite different fashion if we're now trying to conceptualize a different form of global governance. And it is important that we look at inequality and environmental footprints on a larger scale while we are looking at individual elements of institutional relations. So if I were to suggest what it is that's worth our analyzing or lobbying to affect outside the UN, I would say look at the global agenda councils of the World Economic Forum When they produced this report, there were about 45 of them. They now have 80 of them. They meet on a 2-year cycle. They are reasonably documented on their website to see how their argument is being institutionalized for multi-stakeholder governance. Look at various pressures being brought on the UN to be a public-private, well, it's hard to call it United Nations if it becomes public-private. We need a new name for the organization. And I can share with you a recent article that I helped write in the Carnegie Institute for International Ethics on precisely this argument for public-private United Nations. And we should be also looking at how the G20 is being deferred to in making the big decisions on economic, social, and environmental issues, and leaving the other decisions to universal bodies. Inside the UN, what would I commend attention to? Is look at the governance issues related to whatever is proposed for Sustainable Development Goals. Look at what is evolving for the relationship between the United Nations and the G20 and the Financial Stability Board. The evolution of how civil society organizations as major groups or whatever legal term that is used to gain access to the General Assembly and to the Economic and Social Council may represent significantly new avenues for engagement with those bodies. But the terms and the conditions of that being set now will, as I say, set the rules for at least 10 years. Of course, look at what evolves from the high-level political forum and how sustainable development evolves in ECOSOC. To back up for a moment here, why do I have HLPF in lowercase? This is not a typo. This is because the delegations are not even sure what to call it yet. And so as not to prejudge the outcome of what it is that they're doing, they don't put capital letters on high-level political forum because they may end up calling it something else. One reason for that is the suggestion that political issues usually mean security matters. So my invitation is to say that there's a lot happening in the area of sustainable development governance inside and outside the UN system. And there's some quite challenging both research and policy interventions that are important to consider. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harry.